Practicing correctly is a really hard thing to learn when your teacher isn't there next to you helping you practice. So we're going to be talking about practicing. And there's going to be a bunch of different videos following this, so this is the first video to sort of put you on the right track and get you into the right mindset on how to structure your practice session and how to get the most out of the time that you have.
We're talking about practice, man. What are we talking about? Practice?
Okay, today we're talking about practicing. The hardest thing for me to teach my students is how to practice correctly because I'm not there practicing with them. When I was younger, I used to practice for 7 to 8 hours a day. And it turns out, as I got a little older and looking back on my practice sessions, I was actually wasting a ton of time. So the time in the practice room does not equal how good you are. Sorry to break it to you. It turns out what I could have accomplished in those 7 to 8 hours that I was practicing, I could have done in 2 to 3 hours. Before you even get into the practice room, before you even sit down to begin your practice session, you want to make goals. You want to see how much time you have, and you want to budget your time accordingly. I used to make a list of all the things that I had to practice because I had so much repertoire to learn. You want to take into account how long you have to practice, what you want to practice, what specifically in those pieces you want to practice, and how long you want to spend on each piece. You'll sort of get a feel for how long you want to spend on each piece as you're practicing, but that's just sort of a way to think about going about your practice session, because you don't want to spend an hour and a half on one thing and get really frustrated and then not practice for the rest of the time. You want to budget your time accordingly across all of your pieces. Because if you're playing lots of different repertoire, you won't get frustrated as easily, and it'll be a lot more fun. You also want to practice mindfully. You don't want to be playing through your scales and thinking about lunch or Star Wars. You want to be thinking about your tone, your air quality, what your fingers are doing, how your embouchure is, your posture. Practicing technique exercises and scales, it can be a little bit repetitive, which is the whole point of practicing, but you're basically teaching your body to do all these little movements to manipulate the instrument to play well. So it's not just thinking about notes, it's thinking about dynamics, intonation, rhythm, articulation, posture, tone, breathing, embouchure, everything. You don't need to play a measure 1,000 times. You can play it 5 to 10 times and then it's okay to move on. Because basically, our brain does this amazing thing while we're sleeping where it ingrains everything we've learned throughout the whole day. So a lot of the time we want instant gratification. We feel like we need to learn something right this second. But it's going to take a little bit of time for your brain to sort of digest what we just practiced. So if you practice something, say 10 times in a row, and then move on, while you're sleeping, your brain is going to take those 10 times and ingrain it in your memory so that the next day when you sit down to practice that passage, it'll be better. And then the next day, it'll be better. So you have to be a little bit patient, but it works. Trust me on this one. It's great to play a piece of music from start to finish so that you can sort of get the big picture. You can see what the tone of the piece is, where you need to be expressive, where it gets technical. But you also want to focus on the hard parts, the things that are technically challenging. Focus on smaller sections. So when you're practicing, you don't always want to start at the beginning of the piece. You want to jump right to those sections that are giving you difficulty, because otherwise you're just wasting time playing something you're already good at, and then your embouchure gets tired. So you want to jump right to those sections that are giving you a problem. Something that I will say about practicing harder sections, you'll remember which sections are really hard. You don't need to mark them. Whatever you do, do not put a big star next to the really hard parts. Do not highlight them. Because when you're playing the piece, when it comes to the performance, you're going to see that big star come closer and closer and closer, and then before you know it, you're on the hard part, and you're going to just sort of psych yourself out and be like, okay, well, it's time for the hard part. I hope it goes well. No, you don't want to make a big deal about the hard music. You want to just practice it and move on so that you can play it well. If you have a tough rhythm or a tough passage of 16th notes, you want to tear those apart. You want to put it under a microscope. You want to figure out exactly what that rhythm sounds like. You want to see exactly what the notes are that you're playing. Because if you try to blast through a section, your brain isn't processing the notes or the rhythms that you're playing because you're not even sure of it yourself. So your brain's not going to learn it, and it results in sloppy playing. And then once you practice that group of notes, practice the notes before it so you can get into that passage, and then practice the notes after it so you can get out of the passage. You don't want to just isolate the really hard part, because you have to also take into consideration that you have to get into it and then out of it. So when you're practicing, just make sure you put it back into the context of the piece. And I will say this about practicing fast things. I like to tell my students to play everything at a tempo where you can play everything perfectly. Perfect is a word that I don't like to use because nobody's perfect. But you get the idea. You're not making any mistakes. So my student will play at a tempo that's like a little bit slower, but maybe make a couple of mistakes. It's like, no, was that perfect? No. You want to move at a glacial pace when you're learning difficult music. Even if you're playing 16th notes as quarter notes, that's fine as long as you aren't making any mistakes. If you're coming up to, say, a passage that's fast and you aren't quite sure what the notes are, or maybe you're coming up to a note and it's like a D double flat, which is a C, you aren't sure about what the next note is that's coming, even if you're looking ahead, you want to pause before you get there, maybe look at the notes, and then play it. You don't want to play any note that's wrong. Because like I said before, when you go to sleep and your brain is sort of digesting everything that you just practiced, it's going to digest the mistakes too, and the mistakes are going to be ingrained in your muscle memory, so that when you go to practice it the next day, you're going to keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, and then you're back to square one, and you've just wasted all of that practice time when you could have just started slowly and like built it up faster and faster. Now you have to start slowly, build it up faster and faster, unlearn the mistakes that you just learned, and it's a whole big thing. So do yourself a favor and move at a glacial pace and just practice everything mindfully. So that's sort of a little introduction of the things that I'm going to start talking about in this little segment about practicing. I'm going to be doing a video on how to learn fast music faster. You're going to get a video on how to practice without the instrument and get an idea for how long you need to practice, things like that. So if you have any questions about practicing or how to practice, leave them below and I will address them in my coming videos. If you have any practicing tips, anything that I didn't mention, make sure you drop a comment below too. And yeah, you know what to do. Go practice.
Talking about practice, man. What are we talking about? Practice? We're talking about practice, man. We're talking about practice. We're talking about practice.